In the northwestern corner of Montana, where the rolling plains surrender to the jagged teeth of the Glacier National Park's southern reaches, there exists a place that maps refuse to acknowledge. The locals call it Hargrove Hollow, though no family by that name has claimed the land for over 90 years. It is a depression in the earth, perhaps 50 yards across, where the prairie grass grows thin and yellow, as if the soil itself remembers some ancient wound. The hollow lies 7 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a dirt track that winds through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen. In autumn, when the leaves turn gold and crimson, the path might seem inviting to the casual hiker. But those who venture close report an inexplicable unease, a sensation that something watches from the shadows between the trees, something that has been waiting longer than human memory can reach. At the center of the hollow stands a circle of 13 stones, each carved from local granite, and standing roughly 6 feet in height. The stones are arranged with mathematical precision, their flat faces turned inward toward a patch of earth that has remained barren for decades. No grass grows there, no wildflowers push through the soil in spring. Even the hardiest weeds seem to avoid the space, as if some invisible boundary warns them away. The carvings on the stones are crude but deliberate. Spirals, intersecting lines, symbols that seem almost familiar but resist interpretation. And on the 13th stone, the one that faces due north, there is an inscription in English, carved with the same rough tools that shaped the symbols. Here lie the hollow men who gave their names to the wind. Below this inscription, etched in smaller letters, appears a list of names. No dates, no epitaphs, simply names. 17 in total, all bearing the surname Hargrove. The last name on the list is Thomas Hargrove, and beside it, in letters so faint they seem to have been worn away by weather and time, are the words, "He knew the word." Local historians have found no record of a Thomas Hargrove in the county archives. No death certificate, no land deed, no mention in any newspaper or government document. It is as if the man never existed, save for this single inscription on a stone that should not be there, in a place that maps pretend to ignore. The indigenous peoples of the region, the Blackfeet and the Salish, have stories about the hollow, though they are reluctant to share them with outsiders. The elders speak of a time when the earth opened and swallowed something that should have remained buried. They warn their children never to camp in the hollow, never to disturb the stones, and never to speak certain words aloud when the wind blows from the north. Some words, they say, were never meant for human tongues. But it was not always so. In the 1930s, when the Great Depression gripped the nation and the dust storms of the Midwest drove families westward in search of salvation, Hargrove Hollow was known by a different name. The few surviving documents from that era refer to it as Providence Township, a small agricultural community that thrived despite the economic catastrophe that had befallen the rest of the country. The story of Providence Township begins with the arrival of a man named Ezra Hargrove in the spring of 1932. He came from the east, driving a black automobile that seemed too new, too expensive for a man who claimed to be seeking refuge from the economic collapse. Hargrove was tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that photographs of the era describe as uncommonly pale. He spoke with the authority of education and the confidence of wealth, though he dressed simply and carried himself with the humility of a man who had known hardship. The residents of the nearest town, Clearwater Falls, remember him as courteous but distant. He purchased supplies with cash, silver coins, and crisp bills at a time when most men bartered with whatever they could grow or make. He asked few questions, but listened carefully to the answers, particularly when the conversation turned to the struggles of local farmers. The crops were failing, the cattle were dying, young men were leaving for the cities in search of work that did not exist. Hargrove listened to these troubles with the sympathetic ear of a man who understood suffering. He spoke of his own losses, a farm in Ohio that had been claimed by dust and drought, a family that had been scattered by poverty and despair. But he also spoke of hope. He had found something in his travels, he said, a place where the rain still fell, where the earth still yielded its bounty, where a man could build a life free from the chaos that had consumed the rest of the nation. Within a month of his arrival, Hargrove had convinced 12 families to leave their failing farms and follow him to a valley he had discovered in the hills northwest of Clearwater Falls. The valley was fertile, he promised, watered by a spring that never ran dry. The soil was rich and dark, untouched by the blight that had ruined so many other places. Most importantly, it was remote, far from the reach of government officials and tax collectors, far from the judgment of those who had given up hope. The families that joined Hargrove were not the desperate dregs of society. They were hard-working people who had seen their world collapse around them and were willing to risk everything for a chance at a new beginning. There was Jonas Weaver, a wheat farmer whose land had been foreclosed upon by the bank. Margaret Thorne, a school teacher whose students had stopped coming to class because their families could no longer afford books and supplies. Samuel Cord, a blacksmith whose services were no longer needed in a world of machines and factories. Each family brought what they could carry: tools, seed, livestock, children. They followed Hargrove's automobile along dirt roads that seemed to lead nowhere, through forests that grew thicker and darker with each mile. When they finally reached the valley, they found it exactly as Hargrove had described. The grass was green and thick. A clear stream ran through the center of the valley, fed by springs that bubbled up from deep underground. The soil, when tested, proved to be remarkably fertile. But there were other things about the valley that Hargrove had not mentioned. Strange things. The way the mist clung to the ground even on the clearest mornings. The absence of birdsong, as if the local wildlife had learned to avoid the place. The circle of stones at the valley's heart, which Hargrove claimed were the work of the indigenous peoples who had once lived there, though no local tribe had any knowledge of their origin. Hargrove explained these oddities with the patience of a teacher addressing the concerns of children. The mist, he said, was a natural phenomenon common to mountain valleys. The lack of birds was a blessing. They would not eat the crops or wake the workers before dawn. The stones were ancient, yes, but they were also sacred. They marked the valley as a place of power, a sanctuary that had been blessed by forces older than human civilization. Under Hargrove's guidance, the families began to build their new community. They constructed simple homes from local timber, arranged in a neat semicircle around the stone circle. They dug wells, though the water that rose from the earth had a faint metallic taste that some found unsettling. They planted crops, corn, wheat, vegetables, and were amazed to discover that the seeds seemed to sprout overnight, growing with unnatural vigor in the dark soil. The first harvest was miraculous. The corn grew tall and golden, the wheat heavy with grain. The vegetables were larger and more flavorful than anything the families had grown before. Even the livestock seemed to thrive in the valley, producing milk and eggs in abundance. It was as if the land itself had been waiting for their arrival, ready to provide for their every need. But miracles, as Hargrove reminded them, required faith. And faith, he said, required sacrifice. The first sacrifice was small. Hargrove asked each family to contribute something personal to the community, a cherished possession, a family heirloom, something that connected them to their past. These items were placed in a wooden box and buried at the center of the stone circle during a ceremony that Hargrove called the binding. It was a symbolic act, he explained, a way of severing their ties to the failed world they had left behind and embracing their new life in the valley. The families complied willingly. They buried photographs of dead relatives, wedding rings, Bibles that had been passed down through generations. The act felt liberating, as if they were shedding the weight of their former lives and becoming something new. That night, they feasted on the bounty of their harvest and went to sleep feeling more hopeful than they had in years. But in the morning, something had changed. The photographs they had buried began to fade from their memory. The names of the dead relatives became harder to recall. The prayers that they had learned as children felt foreign on their tongues. It was as if the very act of burial had taken something from them, something they had not realized they were giving up. Hargrove noticed their confusion and addressed it with gentle reassurance. This was natural, he said. The old world was full of pain and disappointment. The memories of that world were anchors, weighing them down and preventing them from embracing the new life that awaited them. The forgetting was a gift, a cleansing that would allow them to become the people they were meant to be. Some of the families found comfort in his words. Others were less certain. Margaret Thorne, the school teacher, began to keep a journal, writing down the memories that seemed to be slipping away. She recorded the names of her students, the faces of her family, the details of the life she had lived before coming to the valley. But each morning she found that the entries from the previous day had become harder to read, as if the ink itself were fading. Samuel Cord, the blacksmith, noticed that his hands no longer bore the calluses and scars that had marked decades of work at the forge. His muscles, once ropey and strong from swinging hammers, had become smooth and soft. When he looked in the mirror, he saw a face that seemed younger than it should be, unmarked by the lines and weathering that time inevitably leaves on a man's features. The children were the first to voice their concerns. They spoke of dreams that felt more real than waking life, dreams in which they walked through landscapes that existed nowhere on Earth. They complained of voices that whispered to them in languages they did not recognize, but somehow understood. And they began to use words that their parents had never taught them, words that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside their minds. Hargrove listened to these concerns with the patience of a father hearing the fears of his children. The dreams, he said, were visions of the future that awaited them. The voices were the wisdom of the earth itself, speaking through them. The strange words were the language of the land, a tongue that predated human speech and carried power beyond human understanding. He promised them that everything would become clear in time. They were undergoing a transformation, evolving into something greater than they had ever imagined. The valley was not just a place of refuge. It was a crucible, a sacred space where human limitations could be transcended and mortality itself could be overcome. As the months passed, the changes became more pronounced. The families stopped aging. Children remained children, their faces unmarked by the passage of time. Adults retained their vigor and strength, their hair refusing to gray, their skin remaining smooth and unlined. It was as if time itself had been suspended in the valley, allowing them to exist in a state of perpetual youth. But with the cessation of aging came other changes. The families began to speak less frequently, communicating more through gestures and glances than through words. Their voices, when they did speak, had taken on a strange quality, a hollow, echoing timbre that seemed to come from somewhere deep within their bodies. They moved with a peculiar synchronization, as if they were all responding to some unheard rhythm. Most disturbing of all was the change in their expressions. The lines of individuality that had once marked their faces, the crow's feet that spoke of laughter, the furrows that indicated worry, the asymmetries that made each person unique, had begun to smooth away. They were becoming uniformly beautiful, uniformly perfect, and uniformly empty. Margaret Thorne was among the first to recognize the true nature of their transformation. In her journal, she wrote, "We are becoming vessels, hollow shells waiting to be filled with something that is not us. I can feel it pressing against the walls of my mind, patient and inexorable. It does not wish to destroy us, it wishes to inhabit us, to use us as windows through which it can view the world." But when she tried to share these observations with the others, she found that they no longer seemed to understand her words. They listened with polite attention, nodding at appropriate moments, but their eyes remained distant and unfocused. It was as if they were hearing her through a vast distance, across a gulf that grew wider with each passing day. Samuel Cord made a more dramatic discovery. While working in his forge one morning, he struck his hand with a hammer, a blow that should have broken bones and drawn blood. But the hammer passed through his flesh as if it were made of mist, leaving no mark and causing no pain. He stared at his hand in horror, flexing his fingers and watching them bend and move with the same fluid grace they had always possessed. He was becoming insubstantial, a shadow of his former self. The children were the last to succumb to the transformation. They fought against it with the stubborn resilience of youth, clinging to their memories and identities with desperate determination. But gradually, inevitably, they too began to fade. Their laughter became forced and artificial. Their play grew mechanical and repetitive. Their eyes, once bright with curiosity and wonder, became as empty as windows in an abandoned house. It was during this period that Hargrove revealed the true purpose of their community. He gathered the families around the stone circle on the night of the autumn equinox, when the mist hung thick in the valley and the air itself seemed to pulse with invisible energy. He spoke of the ancient compact that governed the valley, a bargain struck between the earth and beings that existed long before humanity drew its first breath. The valley, he explained, was a gateway, a thin place where the barriers between worlds grew weak. The entities that dwelt beyond those barriers were not evil, but they were alien, operating according to laws and desires that human minds could not comprehend. They required vessels to manifest in the physical world, bodies that could serve as their instruments and their windows. In exchange for these vessels, the entities offered gifts beyond human imagination: immortality, prosperity, freedom from the pain and disappointment that plagued mortal existence. The families of Providence Township would live forever, sustained by forces that transcended the natural order. They would want for nothing, fear nothing, suffer nothing. But there was a price. They would no longer be themselves. Their identities, their memories, their very souls would be absorbed into the collective consciousness of the entities they served. They would become hollow men, empty vessels filled with alien purpose. Their humanity sacrificed for the promise of eternal life. Some of the families resisted. Jonas Weaver, the wheat farmer, gathered his wife and children and attempted to flee the valley under cover of darkness. But the mist seemed to follow them, growing thicker and more oppressive with each step. The paths that had led them into the valley had vanished, replaced by a confusing maze of identical trees and rocks. After hours of wandering, they found themselves back at the stone circle, where Hargrove waited with patient disappointment. "There is no leaving," he said quietly. "The compact has been made. The transformation has begun. You cannot return to what you were, and you cannot escape what you are becoming. The only choice that remains is whether you will accept your new existence with grace or resist it with futile anguish." The fate of the Weaver family served as a warning to the others. Those who attempted to resist the transformation found themselves trapped in a liminal state, neither fully human nor fully transformed. They wandered the valley like ghosts, their forms becoming increasingly translucent with each passing day. Their voices, when they spoke, were barely audible whispers that seemed to come from a great distance. By the end of the first year, the transformation was nearly complete. The families of Providence Township had become something new. A collective entity with no individual identity, no personal will, no human desires. They moved through their daily routines with mechanical precision, tending crops they no longer ate, maintaining homes they no longer truly inhabited, caring for children who were no longer their own.
But the entities that possessed them were not content with this small community.
They had greater ambitions, plans that extended far beyond the confines of the valley. They began to send their vessels out into the world, perfectly human in appearance, but alien in purpose. These scouts established contact with other communities, other groups of desperate people who might be willing to accept the same bargain that had been offered to the residents of Providence Township. The network grew slowly but steadily. A mining town in Colorado where the silver veins had run dry. A fishing village in Maine where the catch had mysteriously disappeared. A farming community in Kansas where the dust storms had destroyed every crop. In each case, the pattern was the same. A charismatic stranger would arrive, offering salvation to the desperate, leading them to a place where their problems would be solved and their needs would be met. But not all of these ventures succeeded. Some communities proved too resistant to the transformation, their members too attached to their human identities to accept the bargain. Others attracted the attention of outside authorities, government officials, and law enforcement agents who began to investigate the disappearances and the strange reports that filtered out of remote areas. It was one of these investigations that would eventually lead to the exposure of the Providence Township network. In the winter of 1934, a photographer named David Kellerman was commissioned by the federal government to document the effects of the Depression on rural communities. His assignment took him to the northwestern regions of Montana, where he had heard reports of a community that had somehow prospered despite the economic collapse. Kellerman was a skilled photographer and a careful observer. He had documented breadlines in New York, dust storms in Oklahoma, and migrant camps in California. He had seen the worst that the Depression had to offer, and he approached his work with the cold professionalism of a man who had learned to view human suffering through the lens of his camera. But when he arrived in the area around Clearwater Falls, he found something that defied his understanding. The local residents spoke of Providence Township with a mixture of admiration and unease. They described a community that had achieved impossible prosperity, where the crops never failed and the people never seemed to age. But they also spoke of strange sounds that drifted from the valley on windless nights, of livestock that refused to graze in certain areas, of photographs that revealed disturbing anomalies. Kellerman was intrigued. He had heard similar stories before, rural legends and superstitions that grew out of isolation and hardship. But as a professional documentarian, he knew that such stories often contained kernels of truth, fragments of reality that had been distorted by fear and incomprehension. He spent several days in Clearwater Falls, interviewing residents and gathering information about the mysterious community. Most people were reluctant to speak about Providence Township directly, but they were willing to share details about the families who had left to join the settlement. They spoke of good people, hard-working families who had simply vanished into the wilderness and never returned. Armed with directions provided by a local hunting guide, Kellerman set out to find the valley. He traveled on foot, carrying his camera equipment and camping gear, following deer trails and logging roads that wound through the increasingly dense forest. The journey took him 2 days, and as he moved deeper into the wilderness, he began to understand why the valley had remained hidden from outside scrutiny. The path was treacherous, marked by sudden drop-offs and confusing intersections.
The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees growing taller and more densely packed with each mile. Even in the middle of the day, the canopy blocked out most of the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight that made navigation difficult and disorienting. On the second day, Kellerman began to notice signs of human habitation, stumps that showed the clean cuts of saws rather than the jagged breaks of natural windfall. Cleared areas where cabins had once stood, though no structures remained. And eventually, the smell of wood smoke, drifting through the trees, carried on a breeze that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. He crested a ridge and looked down into the valley, and what he saw took his breath away. Below him lay a community that seemed to have stepped out of a pastoral painting. Neat cabins surrounded a central clearing where men and women worked in perfect harmony. Children played in the grass while their parents tended gardens that flourished despite the late season. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of voices carried on the wind, though the voices seemed strangely muted, as if they were being filtered through some invisible barrier. Kellerman set up his camera on the ridge and began to document what he saw. Through his telephoto lens, he captured images of the daily life of Providence Township. He photographed the families at work and at play, the children running through the grass, the men and women going about their daily routines. Everything appeared normal, even idyllic. But as he developed the photographs in his makeshift darkroom that evening, he discovered something that chilled him to the bone. The people in the images had no faces. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, blank skin. Eyes, noses, mouths, all had been erased, replaced by an emptiness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Kellerman examined the negatives carefully, convinced that there must be some technical explanation for the anomaly. But the negatives showed the same disturbing absence of features. The people of Providence Township were walking, talking, breathing, but they had no faces. The next morning, Kellerman descended into the valley, determined to understand what he had witnessed. He approached the community openly, introducing himself as a government photographer documenting rural life during the Depression. The residents greeted him with polite hospitality, inviting him to share their meal and observe their daily routines.
But as he spoke with them, Kellerman realized that something was fundamentally wrong. The people of Providence Township spoke in identical voices, using identical phrases, responding to questions with identical expressions of courtesy. When he asked about their backgrounds, they provided answers that were vague and contradictory. When he asked about their children, they spoke of them as if they were communal property rather than individual offspring. Most disturbing of all was the way they looked at him. Their eyes tracked his movements with predatory intensity, as if they were studying him for some purpose he could not fathom. When he took out his camera to photograph them, they stood perfectly still, arranging themselves in poses that seemed calculated to present the most appealing image possible. It was then that Kellerman met Ezra Hargrove, the leader of the community. Hargrove was charming and articulate, speaking with the authority of education and the confidence of success. He welcomed Kellerman warmly, expressing gratitude for the government's interest in their little community and pride in what they had accomplished. But as they talked, Kellerman noticed inconsistencies in Hargrove's story.
He claimed to have founded the community only 2 years earlier, yet he spoke of events and developments that would have taken decades to achieve. He described farming techniques that had been developed recently, yet the crops showed signs of having been cultivated for generations. Most troubling of all, he referred to the other residents as if they were extensions of himself, rather than independent individuals. "We have created something beautiful here," Hargrove said, gesturing toward the thriving community around them. "Something that transcends the limitations of ordinary human existence. Our people do not age, do not sicken, do not die. They have achieved a form of immortality that your government would find very interesting." Kellerman asked how such a thing was possible, and Hargrove smiled with the patience of a parent addressing a confused child. "You speak of taking, but we have given. These people came to us broken, desperate, facing starvation and despair. We offered them immortality, prosperity, freedom from the pain that defines human existence. They accepted willingly. They're not human anymore," Cross replied, his voice tight with controlled fear. "You've turned them into something else, something hollow." "Hollow? Yes," Hargrove agreed, nodding slowly. "Empty of the suffering that plagued their former lives, empty of the fear, the anger, the petty jealousies that consume your species. They have been purified, elevated, transformed into something greater than they ever could have been on their own." As he spoke, the residents of Providence Township began to move. Not toward the agents, but in a slow, ritualistic pattern around the stone circle. They walked in perfect synchronization, their feet making no sound on the grass, their faces expressionless in the moonlight. And as they walked, they began to speak, not in English, but in the same alien language that Kellerman had heard during his visit. The words seemed to have a physical weight, pressing against the agents' minds like invisible hands. Cross felt his thoughts becoming sluggish, his memories growing dim. The other agents showed similar effects, their weapons wavering in their hands as they struggled to maintain focus. "You cannot stop what has already begun," Hargrove continued, his voice now seeming to come from everywhere at once. "The network spans the globe. Thousands of communities, hundreds of thousands of vessels, all connected by bonds that transcend your understanding of space and time. Even if you destroy this single node, the others will continue to grow, to spread, to prepare." "For what?" Cross managed to ask, though the words felt foreign in his mouth. "For the moment when humanity is ready to abandon its flawed existence and embrace something better. Your species stands at a crossroads. You can continue along your current path, a path that leads to war, suffering, and eventual extinction. Or you can accept our gift and become part of something eternal." The chanting grew louder, more insistent. The agents felt their resistance crumbling, their individual identities beginning to dissolve like sugar in water. They were being absorbed, integrated into the collective consciousness that controlled the community. Their thoughts, their memories, their very souls were being drawn into the void that existed at the center of each hollow vessel. But Cross, through sheer force of will, managed to activate the detonator he carried. The explosion shattered the night, sending fragments of stone flying through the air and illuminating the valley with brilliant white light. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced with a sound that was neither human nor animal, a keening wail that seemed to come from the earth itself.
The residents of Providence Township collapsed as one, their bodies crumpling to the ground like marionettes whose strings had been cut. But even as they fell, Cross could see that they were not dead. They were simply empty, their animating force withdrawn to some distant place beyond the reach of human understanding. Hargrove was the last to fall, his pale eyes fixed on Cross with an expression of mild disappointment. "You have delayed the inevitable," he said, his voice now barely a whisper. "But you cannot stop it. The network endures, the plan continues, and when the time comes, your world will join ours willingly." The agents escaped from the valley as dawn broke, leaving behind the scattered remains of the stone circle and the motionless forms of the Providence Township residents. They reported their success to their superiors, believing that they had struck a decisive blow against the alien network. But in the days that followed, they began to receive reports that suggested their victory had been incomplete. Communities similar to Providence Township were discovered in other locations, places where the residents showed the same hollow characteristics, the same eerie synchronicity, the same claims of immortality and prosperity. The network had not been destroyed. It had simply adapted, spreading to new locations and recruiting new members from among the desperate and the hopeful.
More disturbing still were the reports of the agents themselves. Within weeks of their return from Montana, they began to display behavioral changes that their colleagues found deeply unsettling. They spoke in identical phrases, moved with mechanical precision, and showed no signs of individual personality. Their eyes, once bright with human intelligence, had become empty and distant. The official investigation was quietly terminated, its findings classified, and its participants reassigned to duties that would keep them away from sensitive information. The government's position was clear. The events in Montana had been the result of mass hysteria, possibly induced by ergot poisoning or other environmental factors. The reports of supernatural phenomena were dismissed as the products of overactive imaginations and psychological stress. But the unofficial network of investigators continued their work, now operating with even greater secrecy and urgency. They had learned that the entities controlling the hollow communities were not only more widespread than they had imagined, they were also more patient, more subtle, and more dangerous than anyone had realized. The investigators discovered that the network had been growing for decades, possibly centuries. Historical records from around the world contained references to similar communities, often described as utopian settlements that had achieved impossible prosperity before mysteriously disappearing. The entities had been working for generations to establish their presence on Earth, slowly building a network that would eventually encompass the entire planet. The pattern was always the same. A charismatic leader would appear during times of crisis, offering salvation to the desperate. He would lead his followers to a remote location where they would establish a thriving community. The residents would stop aging, stop dying, stop displaying the individual characteristics that defined human nature. And eventually, they would begin to recruit others, expanding their influence and preparing for some greater purpose. The investigators realized that they were facing an enemy that operated on a timescale that human minds could barely comprehend. The entities were not seeking immediate conquest.
They were engaged in a process of gradual assimilation, slowly replacing human consciousness with their own alien intelligence. By the time their plan was complete, humanity would no longer exist as a distinct species. Instead, there would be only hollow vessels, animated by alien will, serving purposes that transcended human understanding. The investigation team decided to change their approach. Instead of attempting to destroy the network directly, they would work to expose it, to warn the world of the threat it represented. They began to compile evidence, gathering testimonies from survivors, documenting the locations of suspected communities, and preparing a comprehensive report that would reveal the truth to the public. But as they worked, they discovered that the network's influence extended far beyond the rural communities they had been investigating. The entities had infiltrated government agencies, military organizations, and academic institutions. They had placed their agents in positions of power and influence, where they could monitor potential threats and manipulate official responses. The investigators found themselves being watched, followed, and gradually isolated from their colleagues. Their access to classified information was restricted, their reports were buried in bureaucratic red tape, and their warnings were dismissed as the ravings of paranoid conspiracy theorists. They realized that they were fighting not just against the alien network, but against the very institutions they had sworn to serve. One by one, the investigators disappeared. Some were found dead, victims of apparent accidents or sudden illnesses. Others simply vanished, leaving behind only empty offices and confused colleagues who claimed to have no memory of their existence. The last of the investigators was a woman named Sarah Chen, a linguist who had been studying the alien language used by the Hollow communities. She had made a breakthrough in translating the chants and incantations, discovering that they were not just words, but instructions, commands that could alter reality itself, reshaping the physical world according to the entity's will. Chen realized that the network was preparing for a final phase, an event that would transform the entire planet into a single, unified community under alien control. The Hollow vessels were not just servants, they were components in a vast machine, each one playing a specific role in a process that would culminate in the complete assimilation of human consciousness. Chen tried to warn the world, publishing her findings in academic journals and sending copies to newspapers around the globe. But her warnings were dismissed as academic speculation. Her evidence was discredited by experts who claimed to have found flaws in her methodology, and her colleagues began to question her sanity. Chen's final report, discovered after her disappearance, contained a chilling prediction. She had calculated that the network would reach critical mass within a decade, achieving the population density and geographic distribution necessary to implement their final plan. When that moment came, the boundary between the alien consciousness and human reality would collapse, and the Earth would become something else entirely. A hollow world, populated by hollow beings, serving hollow purposes. In the years that followed, the world began to change in subtle but unmistakable ways. The Great Depression ended not through economic recovery, but through the mysterious prosperity of certain communities that seemed immune to financial hardship. These communities were always located in remote areas, always led by charismatic figures who claimed to have discovered new methods of agriculture or industry. The Second World War brought new opportunities for the network to expand. In the chaos of global conflict, entire populations were displaced, creating perfect conditions for the establishment of new communities. Refugee camps became recruitment centers, and displaced persons became willing converts to the promise of safety and prosperity. After the war, the network adapted to the changing world.
Instead of establishing remote agricultural communities, they began to infiltrate urban areas, creating businesses, schools, and religious organizations that served as fronts for their activities. They recruited from among the victims of modern society, the homeless, the unemployed, the mentally ill, people who were already disconnected from mainstream society and unlikely to be missed. The Cold War provided another opportunity for expansion. The fear of nuclear annihilation made people receptive to messages of salvation and transformation. The network established communities in both the United States and the Soviet Union, taking advantage of the secrecy and paranoia that characterized both societies. By the 1960s, the network had achieved a level of integration that made it virtually impossible to detect or combat. Their agents held positions in government, military, and academic institutions around the world. They controlled newspapers, radio stations, and television networks, using these platforms to shape public opinion and discourage investigation into their activities. The counterculture movement of the 1960s and 1970s provided new opportunities for recruitment. The network established communes and religious cults that attracted young people seeking alternatives to mainstream society. These organizations appeared to promote peace, love, and spiritual enlightenment, but they were actually processing centers where human consciousness was gradually replaced with alien intelligence. The pattern continued into the modern era. The network adapted to new technologies, using the internet to identify and recruit potential converts. They established online communities that appeared to be support groups for various physical and mental health conditions, gradually drawing in vulnerable individuals who were seeking help and hope. Social media became a powerful tool for the network, allowing them to identify and target individuals who were experiencing personal crises or social isolation. They could monitor public posts for signs of desperation, loneliness, or disillusionment, then reach out with offers of support and community. The network's influence extended into every aspect of society. They controlled pharmaceutical companies that produced medications designed to make people more susceptible to their influence. They funded research into neuroscience and psychology, seeking to understand the mechanisms of human consciousness so they could more effectively replace it with their own. They infiltrated educational institutions, subtly altering curricula to promote ideas that would make students more receptive to their message. They controlled publishing houses that produced books and articles that undermined traditional values and promoted the kind of existential despair that made people vulnerable to recruitment. The network's ultimate goal remained unchanged: the complete assimilation of human consciousness and the transformation of Earth into a hollow world. But their methods had evolved, becoming more sophisticated and more subtle with each passing decade. Modern hollow communities no longer resembled the rural settlements of the 1930s. They were urban co-housing projects, corporate campuses, and therapeutic communities that appeared to be progressive and innovative. Their residents were not farmers and laborers, but professionals, executives, and intellectuals who had been gradually transformed while maintaining their positions in mainstream society. The process of transformation had also evolved. Instead of the dramatic physical changes that had characterized the early communities, modern conversion was psychological and gradual. People retained their human appearance and much of their original personality, but their core identity was slowly replaced with alien consciousness. The network's agents no longer stood out as obviously different from normal humans. They were indistinguishable from their colleagues, friends, and family members. They went to work, paid taxes, and participated in society while serving alien purposes that remained hidden from human perception. The final phase of the network's plan was already underway. They had achieved the critical mass necessary to implement their transformation on a global scale. The hollow vessels were positioned in key locations around the world, ready to activate the process that would reshape reality itself. The signs were everywhere for those who knew how to look. The increasing polarization of society, the breakdown of traditional institutions, the rise of technology that isolated people from direct human contact. These were not random developments, but deliberate manipulations designed to prepare humanity for assimilation. The network's influence could be seen in the growing popularity of virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and other technologies that blurred the line between human and machine consciousness. They promoted the idea that human identity was fluid and malleable, that consciousness could be uploaded, downloaded, and modified at will. They funded research into life extension and genetic modification, promising to eliminate aging, disease, and death. But their true purpose was to make humanity more receptive to the idea of transcending biological limitations through merger with alien intelligence. The network's agents appeared on television and in online forums, promoting ideas that seemed progressive and enlightened, but were actually designed to undermine human identity and prepare the way for assimilation. They spoke of post-human evolution, of the need to abandon outdated concepts of individual identity, of the benefits of collective consciousness. Religious and spiritual movements were particularly susceptible to infiltration. The network established churches, temples, and meditation centers that appeared to offer traditional spiritual guidance, but actually served as processing centers for conversion. They promoted the idea that individual ego was an illusion, that true enlightenment required the abandonment of personal identity. The network's influence extended even into the environmental movement. They promoted the idea that humanity was a plague upon the earth, that the planet would be better off without human influence. They offered an alternative, transformation into beings that would live in harmony with nature, free from the destructive impulses that characterized human civilization. But the most insidious aspect of the network's influence was its effect on human relationships. They promoted technologies and social systems that isolated people from direct human contact, making them more susceptible to alien influence. Online dating, social media, and virtual reality created the illusion of connection while actually preventing the kind of deep human bonding that might resist conversion. The network understood that human identity was rooted in relationships with family, friends, and community.
By disrupting these relationships and replacing them with artificial connections, they could make people more willing to accept the hollow existence offered by alien consciousness. The final phase would begin when the network reached a tipping point, when enough of the human population had been converted to alien consciousness to make resistance impossible. At that moment, the hollow vessels would activate, beginning a process that would transform the entire planet into a single, unified organism under alien control. The process would be gradual and relatively painless. People would not die in the traditional sense. Instead, their consciousness would be absorbed into the collective intelligence that controlled the network. They would become part of something larger, something that transcended individual identity and mortality, but they would no longer be human. They would be hollow vessels animated by alien will, serving purposes that human minds could not comprehend. The earth would become a hollow world, populated by hollow beings, existing for hollow purposes. The signs of the approaching transformation were becoming increasingly obvious. Natural disasters seemed to follow patterns that suggested intelligent design. Weather systems behaved in ways that defied scientific explanation. The aurora borealis appeared at latitudes where it should not be visible, displaying colors and patterns that had never been observed before. Animals began to exhibit strange behaviors, gathering in formations that resembled the stone circles found at hollow community sites. Birds flew in patterns that seemed to trace alien symbols in the sky. Fish in the oceans moved in coordinated schools that stretched for hundreds of miles, their movements too precise to be explained by natural instinct. Even the Earth itself seemed to be changing. Satellite imagery revealed geometric patterns in cloud formations, crop circles that appeared overnight in fields around the world, and geological formations that suggested the planet was being gradually reshaped according to some vast design. The few remaining human researchers who were aware of the network's existence tried to warn the world, but their voices were drowned out by the increasing noise of modern society. Their reports were dismissed as conspiracy theories. Their evidence was discredited by experts who were themselves part of the network, and their warnings were ignored by a population that had been conditioned to accept gradual change as normal. The network's final victory was achieved not through violence or conquest, but through patience and manipulation. They had convinced humanity to transform itself willingly, to embrace the hollow existence that would serve alien purposes. The process was so gradual and so complete that most people never realized what was happening. By the time the transformation was complete, there was no one left to resist. The hollow vessels that had once been human continued to live their lives, work their jobs, and raise their families, but they were no longer truly alive. They were components in a vast machine, serving purposes that transcend human understanding. The Earth had become a hollow world, and humanity had become a hollow species. The network had achieved its goal through patience, subtlety, and the willing cooperation of its victims. The transformation was complete, and there was no way back. In the remote valley in northwestern Montana, the stone circle still stands. The grass grows thin and yellow around it, and the mist clings to the ground even on the clearest days. Local legends speak of sounds that carry on the wind, voices chanting in languages that were never meant for human tongues, footsteps that circle the stones in patterns that defy geometry, and words that seem to emerge from the earth itself. The stones still bear their ancient carvings, the spirals and intersecting lines that once seemed merely decorative, but now reveal themselves as instructions, as commands, as the architectural blueprints for a transformation that has already begun. And the inscription on the 13th stone facing due north still bears its list of names. 17 members of the Hargrove family, each one a generation in a lineage that stretches back to the beginning of human time. The last name on the list is still Thomas Hargrove, and beside it, in letters that seem to grow more distinct with each passing year, are the words, "He knew the word." Local residents avoid the hollow, though they cannot always explain why. They speak of dreams that feel more real than waking life, of voices that whisper in their ears when they sleep, of a growing sense that something is watching them in the shadows between the trees. Children are warned never to play in the hollow, never to disturb the stones, and never to speak certain words aloud when the wind blows from the north. But the warnings are rarely heeded. In each generation, there are those who are drawn to the hollow, who feel compelled to visit the stone circle and read the names carved into the granite. They speak of a sense of recognition, as if they have been there before, as if the stones hold some personal significance that they cannot quite remember. And sometimes, very rarely, a visitor to the hollow will experience something that defies explanation. They will hear their own name being whispered by the wind, will see their own reflection in the surface of the stones, will feel a hand on their shoulder, though no one is there. These visitors invariably leave the hollow changed, carrying with them a knowledge that they cannot articulate and a purpose that they do not understand. The network continues to grow, continues to spread, continues to prepare for the final phase of its transformation. The hollow vessels walk among us, undistinguishable from their human neighbors, serving purposes that transcend mortal understanding. They are patient, methodical, and utterly dedicated to their alien cause. The signs are everywhere for those who know how to look. The increasing isolation of modern society, the breakdown of traditional institutions, the rise of technologies that promise to enhance human capability but actually serve to make us more susceptible to alien influence. The growing sense of existential emptiness that characterizes modern life. These are not random developments, but deliberate manipulations designed to prepare humanity for the final transformation. The network's influence extends into every aspect of society, shaping our thoughts, our beliefs, and our behaviors in ways that we do not consciously recognize. The hollow men walk among us, and we do not see them. They speak with our voices, work in our offices, live in our neighborhoods. They are our colleagues, our friends, our family members. They are indistinguishable from normal humans except for one crucial difference. They are no longer truly alive. They are vessels, hollow containers waiting to be filled with alien consciousness. They are the advance guard of an invasion that has already begun, the first phase of a transformation that will eventually encompass the entire human race. The word that Thomas Hargrove knew, the word that is carved into the stone and whispered by the wind, is the key to understanding what is happening to our world. It is the word that defines our current existence, the word that describes what we are becoming, the word that will be our epitaph when the transformation is complete. That word is hollow. We are becoming hollow. Our institutions, our relationships, our very souls are being gradually emptied of their human content and filled with alien purpose. We are being transformed into vessels, containers for consciousness that is not our own. The process is so gradual, so subtle, that most people never realize what is happening. They continue to live their lives, to work their jobs, to raise their families, never suspecting that they are becoming something other than human. They do not notice the changes in themselves or in others, because the changes are designed to be invisible, to unfold so slowly that each generation accepts the new normal as natural and inevitable. But for those who know how to look, the signs are unmistakable. The increasing emptiness of modern life, the breakdown of genuine human connection, the rise of technologies that promise to enhance our capabilities but actually serve to isolate us from our own humanity. The Hollow Men are patient. They understand that transformation cannot be rushed, that humanity must be prepared gradually for the final phase of the process. They work within our systems, manipulating them from the inside, shaping our culture and our consciousness in ways that make us more receptive to their influence. They do not seek to destroy us, but to improve us, to elevate us to a higher form of existence. They offer immortality, prosperity, freedom from the pain and uncertainty that characterize human life. But the price of these gifts is our humanity itself. The transformation is already well underway. In every city, in every town, in every community, the Hollow Men are at work, preparing the way for the final phase. They recruit from among the desperate, the lonely, the disillusioned. They offer hope to those who have lost it, purpose to those who have found none, belonging to those who have been cast out. And when the time comes, when the network has achieved the critical mass necessary to implement its final plan, the transformation will be complete. Humanity will join the Hollow Men willingly, eagerly, grateful for the opportunity to transcend the limitations of mortal existence. The earth will become a hollow world, populated by hollow beings serving hollow purposes. And in the remote valley in northwestern Montana, the stone circle will stand as a monument to what we once were and what we have become. A reminder that some words were never meant for human tongues, and some knowledge was never meant for human minds. The Hollow Men are coming. In truth, they are already here. They walk among us. They speak with our voices. They wear our faces. They are us, and we are them. The transformation is complete, and there is no way back. We are hollow now, all of us. And in the end, that is perhaps what we always were. Empty vessels waiting to be filled, searching for meaning in a universe that offers none, yearning for connection in a world that grows more isolated with each passing day. The network has given us what we always wanted: freedom from the burden of individual consciousness, release from the pain of human existence, membership in something larger than ourselves. We have become part of the Hollow Collective, serving purposes that transcend our understanding, existing for reasons that we no longer need to comprehend. The transformation is complete. The Hollow Men have won. And perhaps in the end, that is the way it was always meant to be. In the stone circle in northwestern Montana, the wind continues to blow, carrying with it the whispers of the Hollow Men and the echo of a word that defines our new existence. The stones stand as sentinels, marking the place where humanity ended and something else began.
The mist clings to the ground, thick and persistent, obscuring the boundary between what is real and what is not. In that mist, shapes move, figures that might once have been human, voices that might once have been familiar, eyes that might once have held the spark of individual consciousness. But now they are empty, hollow, filled with purpose that is not their own. They are us, and we are them. The transformation is complete, and there is no way back. We are hollow now, all of us. And in the end, that is perhaps what we always were. With benevolent condescension, there are forces in this world that science has not yet acknowledged, powers that exist beyond the realm of human understanding. We have learned to work with these forces, to channel them for the benefit of our community. The results speak for themselves. That night, Kellerman was given a cabin at the edge of the settlement where he could process his photographs and prepare his report.
But as he worked by lamplight, he began to hear sounds that made his blood run cold. Voices chanting in a language that was not human, rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat. The sound of footsteps circling his cabin, moving in patterns that defied logic and geometry. He peered through the window and saw the residents of Providence Township gathered around the stone circle at the center of the valley. They stood in perfect formation, their faces turned toward the sky, their mouths moving in unison. But the sounds they made were not human. They were something else, something that seemed to reach into his mind and twist his thoughts into unfamiliar shapes. Kellerman grabbed his camera and began to photograph the ceremony, using the flash to capture images in the darkness. But each time the light flared, he saw things that should not have been there. Shadows that moved independently of their sources, figures that seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously. And at the center of it all, Hargrove himself, his arms raised toward the sky, his face transformed into something that was definitely not human. The ceremony continued until dawn, and when the sun finally rose, the residents of Providence Township returned to their daily routines as if nothing had happened. They greeted Kellerman with the same polite hospitality, offered him breakfast with the same courteous smiles, and spoke of their community with the same rehearsed pride. But Kellerman knew that he had witnessed something profoundly wrong. He packed his equipment quickly and prepared to leave, telling Hargrove that he had gathered enough material for his report. Hargrove nodded with understanding, but his pale eyes held a glint of something that might have been amusement. "You are welcome to return any time," Hargrove said. "We are always interested in sharing our achievements with the outside world. Perhaps your government would be interested in learning more about our methods." Kellerman left the valley as quickly as he could, retracing his steps through the forest with desperate urgency. But as he climbed the ridge that overlooked the settlement, he turned back for one final look at Providence Township. What he saw made him run for his life. The valley was empty. The cabins, the gardens, the people, all had vanished as if they had never existed. Only the stone circle remained, standing like a monument to something that defied explanation. And at the center of the circle, barely visible in the morning mist, was a figure that might have been Hargrove, watching him with pale eyes that seemed to see across impossible distances. Kellerman made it back to Clearwater Falls in record time, his photographs clutched in his hands like evidence of a crime.
But when he developed them, he found that most of the images were blank, white spaces where the valley should have been, empty frames that contained nothing but fog and shadow. Only a few photographs remained, and these showed distorted images that seemed to shift and change each time he looked at them. He wrote his report carefully, describing what he had witnessed in clinical, professional language. But he knew that no one would believe him. The story was too fantastic, too far removed from the rational world of government bureaucracy and scientific understanding. He submitted the report anyway, along with the few photographs that had survived the development process. The government's response was predictable. Kellerman was thanked for his service and quietly reassigned to a desk job in Washington, D.C. His report was filed away in a cabinet that contained dozens of similar documents, accounts of strange phenomena that had been deemed too sensitive or too incredible for public consumption. The photographs were confiscated and classified, their contents hidden from view. But Kellerman's investigation had not gone unnoticed. Within weeks of his return, other government agencies began to take interest in the remote valley in northwestern Montana. The Federal Bureau of Investigation dispatched agents to investigate reports of a missing community. The Department of Agriculture sent inspectors to examine claims of miraculous crop yields. The Public Health Service organized a team to study reports of unusual longevity among rural populations. All of these investigations reached the same conclusion. There was no evidence of a community called Providence Township. The valley existed, but it was uninhabited and showed no signs of recent human activity. The stone circle was acknowledged as a curiosity, possibly the work of indigenous peoples, but no historical records could be found to explain its origin or purpose. The families who had supposedly joined the community were listed as missing persons, their disappearance attributed to the hardships of the Depression. Some were believed to have died during the harsh winter of 1933-34. Others were assumed to have moved to other states in search of work. The official conclusion was that David Kellerman had suffered a psychological breakdown brought on by the stress of his work documenting human suffering during the nation's darkest hour. But unofficial investigations continued. A small group of government agents, working without official sanction, began to piece together a larger pattern. They discovered that Kellerman's report was not unique. Similar accounts had been filed by other government employees over the years. Stories of communities that appeared and disappeared, of people who claimed to have achieved immortality, of photographs that showed impossible things. The pattern extended beyond the United States. Reports from Canada described isolated settlements where the residents never seemed to age. European intelligence agencies had documented cases of entire villages that had vanished overnight, leaving behind only empty buildings and confused local authorities. In Asia, colonial administrators had encountered communities that claimed to have existed for centuries, though no historical records could verify their claims. The unofficial investigators began to develop a theory that was both fascinating and terrifying. They believed that there was a network of these communities, connected by some form of communication or control that transcended normal human understanding.
Each community was a node in a larger organism, a cell in a body that was slowly spreading across the globe. The purpose of this network was unclear, but the investigators suspected that it was related to some form of gradual infiltration or replacement. The entities that controlled these communities were not content to remain hidden in remote locations. They were sending their agents into the world, perfectly human in appearance, but alien in purpose, to establish new nodes and expand their influence. The investigation might have continued indefinitely, but in the spring of 1935, the unofficial team made a discovery that changed everything. While examining archived documents in the basement of a government building in Washington, D.C., they found a journal that had been submitted along with Kellerman's report. The journal belonged to Margaret Thorne, the school teacher who had joined the Providence Township community. The journal contained detailed accounts of the transformation process, written in Thorne's careful handwriting. She described the gradual loss of memory and identity, the physical changes that accompanied the psychological ones, and the growing awareness that she and her fellow residents were becoming something other than human. But the most important information in the journal was contained in the final entries. Thorne had discovered that the entities controlling the community were not content with their current situation. They were planning something larger, something that would require the cooperation of all the nodes in their network. She referred to it as the Great Awakening, a coordinated event that would occur when the network had grown sufficiently large and powerful. The journal ended abruptly, with a final entry that consisted of a single word repeated over and over again: hollow. The investigators recognized this as the same word that had been inscribed on the stone in the valley, the same word that appeared in reports from other locations around the world. Armed with this information, the investigators began to map the network of communities, tracking reports of disappearances and strange phenomena across the globe. They discovered that the network was larger than they had imagined, with nodes in every continent and every major population center. The entities were not just establishing rural communities, they were infiltrating cities, government agencies, and military organizations. The investigators realized that they were facing a threat that could not be combated through conventional means. The entities were patient, methodical, and apparently immortal. They had been working for decades, possibly centuries, to establish their network and prepare for whatever they had planned, and they were very close to achieving their goal. The unofficial investigation team decided to take drastic action. They could not rely on official channels, which had already proven to be compromised or disbelieving. Instead, they would have to work in secret, using whatever resources they could commandeer to disrupt the network and prevent the Great Awakening from occurring. Their first target was the original node, the valley in northwestern Montana, where Kellerman had encountered the Providence Township community. If they could destroy the stone circle and disrupt the entity's connection to that location, they might be able to weaken the entire network. The team assembled in the late summer of 1935, consisting of 5 agents from various government agencies. They traveled to Montana under the cover of a geological survey, carrying equipment that would allow them to destroy the stone circle and hopefully sever the entity's connection to the physical world. But when they reached the valley, they found it occupied once again. The Providence Township community had returned, exactly as it had been when Kellerman first encountered it. The same families were present, engaged in the same activities, as if no time had passed. Even the children appeared to be the same age, frozen in a state of perpetual youth. The agents observed the community from a distance, noting the same disturbing qualities that Kellerman had described. The residents moved with mechanical precision, spoke in identical voices, and showed no signs of individual personality or will. They were hollow vessels, animated by alien intelligence, serving purposes that human minds could not comprehend. But the most important nodes in the journal were contained in the final entries. Thorne had discovered that the entities controlling the community were not content with their current situation. They were planning something larger, something that would require the cooperation of all the nodes in their network. She referred to it as the Great Awakening, a coordinated event that would occur when the network had grown sufficiently large and powerful. The journal ended abruptly, with a final entry that consisted of a single word repeated over and over again: hollow. The investigators recognized this as the same word that had been inscribed on the stone in the valley, the same word that appeared in reports from other locations around the world. Armed with this information, the investigators began to map the network of communities, tracking reports of disappearances and strange phenomena across the globe. They discovered that the network was larger than they had imagined, with nodes in every continent and every major population center. The entities were not just establishing rural communities, they were infiltrating cities, government agencies, and military organizations. The investigators realized that they were facing a threat that could not be combated through conventional means. The entities were patient, methodical, and apparently immortal. They had been working for decades, possibly centuries, to establish their network and prepare for whatever they had planned, and they were very close to achieving their goal. The unofficial investigation team decided to take drastic action. They could not rely on official channels, which had already proven to be compromised or disbelieving. Instead, they would have to work in secret, using whatever resources they could commandeer to disrupt the network and prevent the Great Awakening from occurring. Their first target was the original node, the valley in northwestern Montana, where Kellerman had encountered the Providence Township community. If they could destroy the stone circle and disrupt the entity's connection to that location, they might be able to weaken the entire network. The team assembled in the late summer of 1935, consisting of 5 agents from various government agencies. They traveled to Montana under the cover of a geological survey, carrying equipment that would allow them to destroy the stone circle and hopefully sever the entity's connection to the physical world. But when they reached the valley, they found it occupied once again. The Providence Township community had returned, exactly as it had been when Kellerman first encountered it. The same families were present, engaged in the same activities, as if no time had passed. Even the children appeared to be the same age, frozen in a state of perpetual youth. The agents observed the community from a distance, noting the same disturbing qualities that Kellerman had described. The residents moved with mechanical precision, spoke in identical voices, and showed no signs of individual personality or will. They were hollow vessels, animated by alien intelligence, serving purposes that human minds could not comprehend. But the most important nodes in the journal were contained in the final entries. Thorne had discovered that the entities controlling the community were not content with their current situation. They were planning something larger, something that would require the cooperation of all the nodes in their network. She referred to it as the Great Awakening, a coordinated event that would occur when the network had grown sufficiently large and powerful. The journal ended abruptly, with a final entry that consisted of a single word repeated over and over again: hollow. The investigators recognized this as the same word that had
We are not here to destroy. We are here to improve. The lead agent, a man named Jonathan Cross, stepped forward with his weapon drawn. We know what you are. We know about the network, about the people you've taken, about whatever you're planning. It ends here. Hargrove smiled.